Welcome to the Liberty Exchange. I'm Jonathan Fortier. My guest today is Johan Norberg, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and a writer who focuses on globalization, human progress, and intellectual history. Norberg is the author and editor of more than 20 books, translated into more than 30 languages. They include In Defense of Global Capitalism, Progress, 10 Reasons to Look Forward to the Future, and Open, the Story of Human Progress, and most recently, Peak Human, What We Can Learn from the Rise and Fall of Golden Ages, which is due out in the US in September 2025. Today I'm talking with Johan about his book titled, provocatively, The Capitalist Manifesto, Why the Global Free Market Will Save the World, which came out in 2023. Johan, thanks for joining us on the Liberty Exchange podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And congratulations on the recent announcement of winning the Hayek Prize from the Manhattan Institute.
Thank you.
You can add that to the many other accolades and prizes you've received from The Economist and other organizations.
But yes, getting it in the name of Hayek is especially worthwhile.
Well, I think so. And it seems doubly fitting that we're talking about this book now because there's so much Hayek in this book, isn't there, really?
Quite right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You picked that up, yeah.
Well, I thought that it would be fitting and I think compelling to start our meeting with a coffee break. Normally you don't start with a coffee break, but I thought we could because you have a very compelling section in your book where you discuss coffee and use it as a way of illustrating the power of capitalism. You and I have both a strong love of coffee, and doubtless we've spent time in coffee shops. And while in those coffee shops, we doubtless have seen students or other young people typing away on their laptops. And sometimes they're wearing T-shirts like Che Guevara T-shirts, or they have stickers on the top of their laptop which read things like "Crush Capitalism," right? Or "Fight the Man," "Tax the Rich." And of course, this is a great irony given the environment that they're sitting in and the beverage they're drinking. So, why don't we explore a little bit the irony that some of these people have with regards to their opinions about the global capitalist order and their perspectives and how they square with what you're trying to write in this book.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. I don't just write about coffee in my books and documentaries quite often to get a coffee break, but that's one reason. But also because I think it's a very easily accessible way of getting the basic, I would say, Hayekian insight that civilization is built on the knowledge and creativity of millions of strangers whom you've never met and who have access to other ideas and local knowledge that you cannot comprehend. And that's what we're getting in a coffee shop. I mean, we do get it in that technology that the Eat the Rich guy is using all the time, but we do it in the cup of coffee as well. I mean, I don't know how to make a cup of coffee, not from beginning to end. It takes about a year to get from the cultivating the beans to pouring the coffee into your cup, and it's poured by thousands of people who have each specialized in various forms of activity, from the transportation, the hardware, the software, the trucks, making sure that we get the chemicals that keep the water safe for drinking, and even the bizarre, the people who specialize in developing chemicals that makes the moths in warehouses stopping from procreating so that they don't eat the coffee beans. I mean, thousands of people who think so hard about my cup of coffee so that I don't have to. So I can just go there and get a cup of coffee just sort of 5 minutes after I realized that I wanted one. It's there in the coffee shop without me having called in advance, telling them to prepare one. But that's the fact. With that cup of coffee and the 2 billion other cups that are being poured every day, it's a miracle of cooperation between strangers in a supply chain that is spontaneously, voluntarily organized across the whole globe. It's a globe-spanning venture. So I think it's a way of retelling Leonard Read's old story about the pencil that Milton Friedman made famous, that actually everything we see around us is a magical example of the voluntary cooperation in a free market.
Yeah, you have a wonderful section in which you talk about the reciprocal thank yous that people exchange, not only in coffee shops, but in most shops. Why don't you just say a little bit about that? Because I think that was a compelling a compelling way of illustrating this voluntary cooperation.
Yeah, it's strange. I'm brought up by my parents to say thank you when someone has done you a service. But when we go to the coffee shop or to the local grocers and you go to the checkout, you thank them and they thank you because we have each done each other a service. It's mutually beneficial. We wouldn't have done it unless both parties thought that we benefit from this. And that double thank you is really extraordinarily, if we think about economic systems historically. Every way we've tried to organize the economy, from slavery to feudalism to socialism and fascism and mercantilism and corporatism, is always based on someone telling the others what to do and taking the rewards of their labor and exploiting them. Free market capitalism is the first system that's based on this double thank you, that you go to the part of the economy where you think that you will create the most value and you exchange it for the best efforts of somebody else. And you each do each other a favor, and therefore we create more innovation and more growth than would otherwise have happened. But more than that, it creates that basic dignity of people having a say. They decide out of their own free will on what to do with their lives.
Another nice dimension of using this coffee shop example that you explore is that so many of the ideas that we cherish that came out of the 18th century were discussed in these coffee shops.
Good point.
And they literally fueled conversation about toleration, about free speech, about the open society, about the power of markets, and so on and so forth. And Voltaire apparently famously would drink 75 or 100 cups of coffee a day.
Yeah, that's crazy. But you can see why he got lots of things done as well. Yeah, I have actually visited La Procope in Paris, where Voltaire sat. He had his own desk there, drinking coffee all day and creating the Enlightenment. And obviously, I think three things are important about coffee in that regard. First of all, it means that you don't have to drink alcohol all the time. It has its place and time, alcohol as well. But, water was dangerous, so they needed sort of beer or something like that. But then when coffee came to Europe, they could do that instead. And it's also a pick-me-up. You become sort of energized and you can do more work, read more books. But also, you meet new people. You meet people from different ways of life and who have specialized in other areas as well. So suddenly the philosophers sat there side by side with the mechanics and with the entrepreneurs, exchanging news, new insights, new discoveries. And that's another Hayekian insight, I think. The more we mix and match, the more knowledge do we make use of.
Yes, exactly. And you do a wonderful job of outlining the ways in which a market allows us to coordinate this disparate knowledge to create something that is fruitful for everyone and more prosperous for everyone. Let's pivot to looking at some of the earlier chapters in which you discuss the critique of capitalism and provide counterexamples to the power of capitalism to unleash prosperity. You begin by quoting Naomi Klein, who refers to savage capitalism as the way that she describes it. And you provide lots of data to indicate that capitalism has been, in fact, one of the greatest anti-poverty systems in the last 20 or 30 years. Perhaps you could just outline why that is and how that has come about.
Yeah, it's really been explosive. Naomi Klein talked about how the 1990s ushered in capitalism in its most savage form. That's what she called it. But when you look at the data, we've had the best era in human history when it comes to wealth creation and poverty reduction. Had this been done under any kind of sort of government plan, I'm sure they would have erected statues to the people who came up with the idea. But that's not how it happened. It happened through individual efforts of millions and millions of people who got more freedoms. So they lifted themselves, some 130,000 people, out of extreme poverty every day since 1990. It's extraordinary. So how did they do that? Well, more freedom, specifically economic freedom, so that people had, for the first time, got the opportunities to move to the cities, to the sectors where they could create more value. We got more free trade so that they could sell their goods to other markets, to richer markets, and more flows of capital and technology across borders, so that there was an incentive for businesses to start global supply chains and hire people in poor countries as well, which meant that they got access to technology, machinery, know-how, and management that made them much more productive. And when you're more productive, when you can produce more, you also become more valuable to the employer, who pays you more in the long run. So we got this increase in real wages and this reduction in poverty. It didn't happen because of a plan. It happened because people wanted to improve their lives and got more freedom to do it.
What about the critique, though, Johan, that, we have opened up the world to trade, and the result has been that we have introduced these factories into the developing world, and we've created these abysmal working conditions for laborers in the developing world, so-called sweatshops that exploit labor and create lives of misery for people.
I've traveled to countries like that and visited sweatshops like that. And what I've found out is that the only thing that's worse than being exploited is not to be exploited. The poorest places on the planet without any kind of economic, social development are the ones who never got factories like that, who weren't integrated into the global economy. Whereas places like Bangladesh, Vietnam, Indonesia, China, India, they've grown tremendously in the past 30 years. And so has Central and Eastern Europe, as they got what we often call sweatshops, because obviously compared to what we have in the US, in Sweden, after 150 years of economic development, yeah, we wouldn't want a job like that. But when I ask people in those factories, so what are the major problems here? I get the answer. The biggest problem is that I can't get a job like this for my brother and for my son. There are too few opportunities like this. It looks bad compared to us, but these are the stepping stones out of poverty, because it's the access to all that technology, all that know-how that makes you more productive so that you can create more. Once that happens, well, first of all, you get better wages, less poverty, but also you have these spin-off effects where you can start your own business, perhaps with the know-how that you've now received. Once you establish factories and harbors to produce cheap toys from, Hong Kong once upon a time, pretty soon you can put high-tech goods into those harbors, those containers, and produce them in those factories as well. So this is how East Asia and Central and Eastern Europe was developed. That's how they got out of poverty. And actually, once upon a time, that's how we did it in Sweden and in the US as well, by having access to sweatshops like that.
Yeah, people forget that 19th century Europe and America had many sweatshops, and those are a thing of the past because they were allowed to produce the productivity that they produced.
And I'm often so incredibly disappointed when sort of well-meaning protesters in the West talk about sort of, oh, those labor conditions, those jobs are too bad, so we shouldn't trade with them because that's exploitation. I mean, what would have happened to my own country, Sweden, if in the mid-19th century, rich countries like France and England comparatively would have said that, no, look, the Swedes are too poor, their working conditions are too dismal, so let's not buy their products, let's not buy their timber and iron ore. Go away and become rich in some other way so that you can improve those standards, and then we can trade with you. Well, then obviously we would still be in sweatshops today, because being able to be integrated into international supply chains was the way to get out of that poverty.
Yeah. The gains have been tremendous and they've been rapid. What do you say to the argument that they haven't been quick enough, and that we could step up positive change, we could create even more prosperity quicker if we were to find some sort of philanthropic scheme, we could increase charitable donations to developing countries. And with these cash injections, we could build factories and we could build supply chains. And if we had the governments involved, then we would maybe be able to see more rapid change for more people.
Yeah, I would like to see those alternatives, because this is actually something that we've tried since the end of the Second World War, a massive transfer of capital from wealthy governments to poor governments around the world. And we have yet to see, I would say, a single successful example of economic development created through foreign aid like that. I think it can play a role in specifically targeted versions when it comes to children's health, vaccinations, malaria, bed nets, perhaps, but that's not creating economic development. That's specific humanitarian assistance. The problem with thinking that you can kickstart economic development through just sending money to a particular place is that it's all dependent on the institutions that exist there. Will that money be well spent? Will it be spent in making people more highly educated and more productive and create those productive forces in the economy, or doesn't it? Well, if they have institutions like that are useful, create the right incentives, in that case, we will see a transfer of private capital, investments into those places in any case, just because businesses and investors are interested in profits, and they would see how they would benefit from that. So in that case, foreign aid would be useless. But if you don't have institutions like that, if the institutions are corrupt, or if they are just generally not creating productive wealth, well, then that money will be wasted, and it might even reinforce those bad institutions. And that's something we've seen in many poor countries as well, that if you, in a very poor country, create a very rich center, a rich government which controls lots of capital to be distributed to particular groups, in that case, you'll see rent seeking. You will see businesses and political groups who just fight over that power rather than fighting over how to create more wealth in the future.
When you refer to institutions in the developing country, or the lack of institutions, what sort of institutions do you have in mind?
Well, the most basic ones is that you have a system of rule of law, so that the rules apply equally to everybody, which includes things like secure property rights, so that we know whose property, parcel of land or a factory is, which makes the whole difference between what I've seen in a place like Kenya, talking to a farmer who doesn't want to invest in his land because he knows the property is not safe. So if I invest long term and it's successful, perhaps some powerful guy who says that he's the uncle of a guy in the government, he would have to give that up. All wealth creation is long term. You invest in the future. That's what you do when you open up land or start a factory or invest in a business. And then you need to know what rules will apply here 10 years, 20 years from now. And to make sure that those rules apply to the government as well, so that civil servants or politicians don't have the right to just act arbitrarily and skip all the rules that exist there. So rule of law, property rights, and free enterprise, so that you're allowed to start your own business in any kind of sector, so that you can expose the incumbents in the economy to constant competition.
Wonderful. Yes. Let's talk a little bit about the critique that one seems to hear increasingly, and that is that capitalism, especially globalized capitalism, has hollowed out the manufacturing centers of industrial countries like the United States and certain European countries. There's been a flight of manufacturing, and as a result, we have lost a golden age of prosperity. An age when maybe capitalism did work, but today capitalism isn't working as well for everyone. And in this golden age, people worked fewer hours. They could support families with just one job. They earned comparably similar or higher wages, and so on and so forth. What do you say to critiques like this about the essentially the deterioration or the corruption of capitalism?
Yeah. Well, I say that the excuse for that nostalgic narrative is usually a bad memory, that we have a way of looking at past experiences through rose-tinted glasses and think that life was easier because, after all, people got through it, and civilization kept moving. But if you look at how people really lived back then and the circumstances surrounding it, that story is not as beautiful as some people think. In the Capitalist Manifesto, I write about Daniel Clark, a historian who talked to people in Michigan, in Detroit, in those places in the 50s and the 60s, having supposedly the best jobs, the most stable jobs, and that's what we want to go back to. Both the left and the right has some sort of nostalgic vision of that's the way working conditions should be. And what he found out was that that's not how they experienced it there at the time. It was precarious jobs, low wages, and they had to borrow heavily to even afford the car that they were producing in those places. And if they, because of precarious unemployment, for a brief moment in time, about a tenth of all unemployment was based in Detroit, they had to give up their cars and their homes. So what is it that we're remembering, really? Well, there were some parts of that economy, some union organized jobs, in a few particular years, 1953, 1954, that cohort who got jobs back then, who had fairly safe jobs, fairly well-paying jobs compared to what came before it. Because remember, Americans had just gone through the Great Depression and the Second World War, and most people still lived in a very unproductive agricultural jobs. So this seemed amazing compared to the alternatives, and it was. But what's it like compared to what we have today? Well, when you look at what they actually made, even the few lucky ones who got those jobs in 1953 and 54, well, the average wage was $1.3 an hour, and adjusted for inflation, that's what you get at an entry-level job in an Amazon warehouse today. So we have to realize that things have kept moving and improved since then, partly as a result of what people call de-industrialization. It's not really deindustrialization because we're producing more manufacturing value today in the US than we did in the 1950s and the 1960s. That has kept climbing. But obviously, we don't need as many people doing it because of automation, because we're becoming more productive all the time. And this is not an aberration. This is not a mistake. This is what happens as countries get richer. That's happened in every other industrialized country, and happened in Germany in the 1970s, in Japan in the 1980s, in South Korea in the 1990s. It is actually happening in China right now. Fewer people work in manufacturing because we're able to produce manufactured goods with fewer hours, fewer people in those factories. And that's a good thing and not a bad thing, as long as we do it from a position of strength, where we create more value all the time so that we have the purchasing power to hire those people who lose those jobs in new service sectors and moving on to the other things that we couldn't afford in the 1950s and 60s, the local service sectors, more higher education, better healthcare, entertainment, technology, and so on.
Another critique that one encounters is that people may be able to access a larger basket of goods in some circumstances under the current capitalist model, but they are unable to move socially. There's very little social or economic mobility. And as a result, they're sort of stuck and unable to access better paying jobs. You use a good analogy. I think is it Schumpeter's example of the hotel. Perhaps you could just outline how that can help understand some of the dynamics at play.
Yeah, Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, he pointed out that when people talk about inequality, it's as if they were talking about a hotel with several floors, and they always look at, there's always this bottom floor with the worst, smallest, shabbiest rooms. And there's always luxurious suites up there with nice espresso machines and nice...
Back to the coffee.
Exactly, always. Nice bed linen and so on. And perhaps with time, they even get more floors and even more luxurious suites. So it looks like the top is always getting away from the bottom, and society is dragged apart, and we have more inequality than in the past. But Schumpeter's point was that it's not the same people living in those hotel rooms all the time. People move places and they move upwards. And some of the people who live in those suites, they check out and move elsewhere instead. And lots of people who enter in the bottom, shabbiest rooms, they get experiences, they get more know-how, they make a career, and they move upwards in those suites. So it's not enough to have this sort of one moment in time look at what separates the different floors. You also have to think about the mobility of moving upwards. And that's historically something that free market economists have been very, very good at promoting.
Yeah. I suppose another thing to remind oneself of is that the bottom floor is much better off now than they were in the past.
Right.
So what constituted hardship on the bottom floor in 1900 was very different than what constitutes hardship in 2025.
Yes, that's an incredibly important point. And you suddenly, I mean, with the hotel analogy, well, you have running water and you have hot showers even in the bottom floor. And that's something that, a third of all American households did not have in 1950. That's how fast we've moved on. Even though I would like to add, if we're talking about real estate and floors, we do have a problem in many modern rich countries with social mobility, partly because we've stopped building where people want to move. We've been so heavily regulated. We have so much NIMBYism, and not in my backyardism, that it's almost impossible to build where people want to live. So it's been difficult to people to move to dynamic labor markets because oftentimes they lose more through the cost of that real estate than they earn in an extra wage. And that's problematic for the future because this is really being in those urban agglomerations where with expanding companies, higher education, that's a way to move to Schumpeter's top floors in the long run. So we certainly need a deregulation agenda when it comes to building.
Yeah. You do a good job of outlining that many of the causes of the problems that people critique are more likely caused by government intervention rather than the market. And I think that is another case of what is seen and what is not seen. In the background lie these regulations and taxes and tariffs and so forth that stifle the economy and prevent the creative destruction and the innovation that we expect from the market.
That's right. Yeah, we shouldn't just look for Adam Smith's invisible hand that sort of guides us to the places where we create most value. But is it Milton Friedman's son, David Friedman, who said also look for the invisible foot of the government, which creates sort of regulations and taxes that distorts that behavior and makes it more difficult to accomplish our goals?
Yeah, sure. One of the characteristics of the modern economy are more temporary jobs that tend to adapt and change more rapidly, and this is often referred to as the gig economy. And you have a section, I think, which outlines many of the advantages and benefits of the gig economy and the negative unintended consequences that can arise when we try to create secure jobs, long-term jobs out of gig economy jobs. Perhaps you could just say a few words about that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's easy to sympathize with people saying, look, it's very precarious. They don't have a safe long-term employment in gig jobs. You only get a few hours here and there, and you have to work really hard, and you have to be quick on those bikes to deliver food on time. So I can see why trade unions and well-meaning regulators think that, no, let's force businesses to treat them as normal employees with all the benefits and the long-term schedules and so on. But when we look at the results of that well-meaning policy, it's again the invisible foot of governments, because the first thing that happens is that, if we're to supply people with all those extra benefits and that higher stable wage, we have to make sure that this is a very productive, very fast guy on that bike. So the first thing that happens is that you lose those who might have the most difficulty getting a long-term, well-paying job to begin with. Those people who might get their first foot onto the labor market by doing gig jobs. Just a few hours here and there, which shows that what you can do, and perhaps you also improve. You get the experiences so that you can move on. You can move to the next step. You get a better job. You get better wages instead. It's the same problem in a way that we've seen with minimum wage laws, which basically means if you have a minimum wage at 50% of the median. It means that if you're 49% as productive as the median worker, you're priced off the market, and you don't have that possibility to, well, enter the first floor of Schumpeter's hotel, which would have made it possible to move on.
Yes. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about billionaires. There's this sense that the various people who are financially very successful somehow have come by their wealth unethically or unfairly, if you will. I'll start by reading a passage from the earlier pages of your book, because I think that it captures the spirit of your exploration of the 1%. You're quoting Anne de Lettres. Africa's dictators had many conflicting aims, but the president of the Club du Sahel, Anne de Lettres, once summed up their common denominator. Well, he said, there is one thing we all agree on, that private traders should be shot. And wonderful quotation to set the tone for the way that many people feel about the super rich. What would be wrong with simply reallocating the incredible wealth that the 1% have to alleviate the many problems that we want to address now?
Well, I'd say there are two major problems. First of all, that money wouldn't go very far. But secondly, we would also ruin the wealth creation and the innovation that made them that rich to begin with, because we would undermine those incentives. I did a back of the envelope calculation for the Capitalist Manifesto by looking at, because, Oxfam and that kind of charity organizations, they always talk about, look, the billionaires of the world, they own more than 4.6 billion poor people on the planet. And I just, that sounds awful. Right, I agree. So
Sure.
Let's take their money and just hand it to all those poor people. And then what I found out is that if we do that and take all their wealth and hand it over there, obviously all the stock markets of the world would collapse instantly, because it's not sitting there in a cash pile. It's invested in companies to create something. But if we didn't just sort of assume that we wouldn't destroy the world stock markets, we would increase the average wage of the world's poor by I think it's some 40% or so. And it's not nothing, but only for a year, because then the money is gone, because it's not a cash pile. It's something that is being created, a value that's being created every year. And so if a smarter redistributionist then would say, okay, but let's instead invest them in some sort of index fund and give them the revenue every year from that fund, we would increase the wages of the world's poor by around 4% a year. 4%. Again, it's not nothing, but it's not like it solves all the problems of the world. And interestingly, it's actually the same increase that the world's poor just got in these past 15 years annually, because of the normal doings of the market, of trade around the world. And that's much more impressive, because that's compounded growth. That's an extra 4% this year, and then an extra 4% on top of all of that, and so on. It's not just sort of 30 cents annually extra. So forget about all those stories about how this would solve all the problems of the world. It wouldn't make much of a difference. But the more important thing is that, how did those rich people get rich? I mean, yes, if they stole that money, if they got it from their politician friends, that's a bad thing, and we should take their money.
Yeah.
We should abolish those that form of corruption. But on a free market, usually you become rich by enriching others, by coming up with the goods, services, the technology, the solutions that others are so interested in that they hand over their money to you and then get that mutual double thank you. And this is actually how we become richer as a society, by coming up with smarter solutions, by doing something a little bit faster, cheaper, or better tomorrow than we did today. That's the great benefit to the world that the rich are doing, including, I'd say, to the world's poor, coming up with the technological solutions for transportation, for technology, for software and for hardware, making it possible to produce steel a little bit cheaper. That's much better than getting an extra 30 cents a year from some form of redistribution.
Yes, exactly. And the redistribution that you refer to that increases wages or net worth 40% really only amounts to a few $100s, really,
Yeah,
when you actually look at the actual numbers involved.
incredibly important point.
Yes,
Exactly.
yeah. Well, this also relates to the belief that capitalism generates monopolies. These 1% are not 1% of the richest people for forever, for very long. Often they occupy these positions of tremendous wealth based on the fluctuations of the share price of their companies. And they can lose hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in value in the course of a week, depending upon how a company's evaluation might change due to market forces and so forth. But that is also the case with companies themselves, isn't it? And you provide, I
Yeah,
think, a good example of Nokia.
right.
And perhaps you could just say a few words about that to illustrate the dynamism of the capitalist economy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm old enough to remember that Nokia was the great cell phone king of the world, and I remember my mother being so surprised when I would get a cell phone from anybody else than Nokia. In 2007, there was a famous Forbes cover, the business magazine, with I think it was the president of Nokia, with the headline, "Can anyone catch the cell phone king?" It seemed impossible because they had grown so big. Everybody wanted a Nokia, and if everybody else did, you wanted one as well. And they had all this market power, so it seemed almost impossible. But obviously, I think it was the next year, wasn't it, that Steve Jobs presented the iPhone, and the rest is history. And it's interesting. I wrote a book uh, on capitalism in the early 2000s, and I used Nokia as an example to show people then, when Nokia was so powerful and they had all that market power, how dynamic the economy is. Because just 20 years ago, Nokia was just a Finnish producer of tires and of rubber boots, but they had evolved and developed a new market and a new business model and became the cell phone king. Isn't that impressive? Well, the next time around, when I write about Nokia and about global capitalism, almost nobody remembered that Nokia was the cell phone king, because they're gone from that market entirely. So capitalism is quite ruthless to companies that don't deliver, who don't keep up with the technology, constantly upgrading their offers to hand people the best things. And we can see that all over. It's not just Nokia, of course. If you look at the Fortune 500 companies, only 51 of the companies were there in 1955 as well, when the Fortune 500 index was started. So 90% basically has disappeared, gone bankrupt, been acquired, or just sort of collapsed into smaller entities. That's the turnover that we see in free markets.
Yes. Yet people make the mistake of taking a snapshot in time and thinking that this represents a longer period than it actually does. And the dynamism plays out to the benefit of the consumer in general, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's this great quote by the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises about how people look at the big businesses on the planet and look at the guy steering the ship, the president, the chairman, and think that they're in control, that they lead the way and they can go wherever. But they don't even steer the ship. they can only follow the waves being made by the consumers, who constantly point out that they want something better, cheaper, or faster tomorrow than today. And if they don't, they're removed from that ship, those executives, because and even those ships as well, the companies are gone the next time, because really the consumer is in charge of capitalism, not capitalists.
Capitalism produces the greatest overall prosperity, lifts people out of poverty. But what about the social and moral questions? Doesn't capitalism lead to you know, psychic anxiety, loneliness, isolation, competitiveness? Doesn't it create a society in which we're all at war with one another, competing for scarce resources, trying to get more and more? Wouldn't we be more socially harmonious if we lived in some sort of quasi-socialist collectivist society?
Yeah, yeah. Who knows? And in that case, let's try it. Feel free to, if you want to live in a kind of other kind of society. That's one of the great things with a liberal free market sort of capitalism. You can be a socialist. You can create your own collectives, your own communities. Whereas it's very hard to live as a capitalist in a socialist country. I understand why this is the major complaint from many intellectuals, from both the conservative, national conservative right, and from many leftists, and that's because they're losing the other debates. They argued for a very long time that capitalism wouldn't be able to create this prosperity, wouldn't be able to reduce poverty. Now it's done that, and they say, yeah, but what's the point? Does it really deal with the affairs of the heart and the meaning of life? There are other issues, and obviously there are other issues that are more important in many ways, and where I would argue that if you're looking for the meaning of life in any kind of political system, you're looking in the wrong place. It's not the place where we can solve these problems. And when I hear those arguments that we should be living in another form of community, I ask them, please get back to me when you have reached an agreement among yourself, from the national conservatives to the woke socialists to the environmentalist degrowthers, on which kind of community that would be. And I would think that they would end up in a situation where they would almost kill each other over what kind of society this would be. Would it be religious? Would it be secular? Would it be focusing on hard work in mines to create values? Or would it be sort of living in harmony with nature? Would it be socialist distribution or some sort of traditional meritocratic hierarchy? They don't have a common answer to that, and because they come at it from different ways. And then if you're talking about community and unity, but you want to enforce it on everybody else, you don't create community, you create eternal strife. You create tribalism, where we try to impose our will on others. And this is where I would say that a classical liberal society based on a free market economy is the best place to search for the meaning of life, because we don't try to impose it on everybody else. You're free to search for the kind of communities, the kind of family structures, the kind of neighborhoods that you are interested in, rather than something that a political philosopher happened to be interested in. Does it have to be sort of this kind of fierce, competitive, materialist society that they often talk about? I'd argue the contrary, and we can see this empirically. It's so interesting that when we're looking for people who say that they're more interested in community in civil society, in friendships, in being generous, in donating blood, in caring for the local neighborhood, caring for animals, and so on, you go to individualist rich societies. That's where people are the least interested in sacrificing everything for another few buck. And it sounds very counterintuitive, especially to those anti-capitalist intellectuals who think that capitalism means that we have to constantly focus on material gain. I think that the empirical data is pretty clear here. One of the best things with having money is that you don't have to care about money all the time. You become richer so that you can also devote more of your time and your energy and your community to other values. That's what we're seeing. And if you just look at empirical data, then it's in those rich capitalist societies that people say that they are more likely to have friends, communities that will help them out if they have trouble, and they'd be more willing to help out than in poorer and less capitalist economies. And that tells you that those intellectuals, they've made a mistake somewhere. They've confused the problems, existential problems that we will always have, but with a particular form of society that they don't like. It reminds me of David Hume, the great Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, who said of his, sometimes friend, sometimes foe, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French anti-capitalist philosopher, that, look, he's just sad and miserable and angry with everybody all the time, but he doesn't want to assume responsibility for it. So instead, he blames modern society because that's a cheap sort of opt-out from the whole debate.
Sure, yes. And this critique seems to confuse political society with civil society, doesn't it? And that within the contexts of politics and government, in the spaces in between, people are going to churches and social clubs and sports clubs, and they're getting together with family and friends and all of the things that you mentioned. And that's where the meaning is created. And it's the prosperity of the capitalist economy that makes that possible, if I understand you.
Absolutely. And that's an incredibly important point, because oftentimes, conservatives like Patrick Deneen and socialists like Norina Hertz, who complain about modern capitalism, it turns us into atoms we don't have any relationships with others, and say that their main complaint with classical liberals is that we don't think of communities. We think that every man is an island, and that's complete rubbish. I don't know what they've been reading, because, that's not what John Locke or Adam Smith or anyone talked about. They were always very clear on that matter, that human beings are social animals. That's what we are. That was not the bone of contention with the sort of socialists and conservatives of that time. The major controversy was, does that fact that we live in social relationship, which is a descriptive fact, is that also a normative fact? Do we have to be loyal to the particular community, religion, family that we're born into, even though something else might be what we're looking for?
And then Adam Smith and John Locke and others said no, the real way to create meaning in your life is to find the kind of church, the kind of sports club, the kind of community that represents your values and your identity. And I don't know what the meaning of life is, but I'm pretty sure that the chance is greater to reach for it if more people are allowed to look for it, rather than just having one political philosopher or a government trying to tell us what that is. And that's what we're seeing in these communities, in civil societies, which are based on human instinct, the fact that we're social animals, but it's also been made possible because of modern capitalism and the wealth that it's created. Because for several reasons, one of them being that our average working hours are about half today of what they were 150 years ago. So suddenly we don't have to work every hour that we're awake to sustain ourselves, our families. So we have more time to devote to other things, to other interests, other parts of our identity, and to develop that. And that's what we're seeing in thriving, dynamic communities, in civil societies, in free market-based societies. That's where we get it.
Johan, thanks for coming on the Liberty Exchange podcast and for everything you do to defend free societies.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.